All right, so picture this. You're looking at a world map, but it's not the one we're used to.
Okay.
The colors are constantly shifting borders, redrawing themselves as empires rise and fall.
Wow.
That's the world we're diving into today.
Sounds intense.
Specifically, the British Empire in the early 20th century,
Okay.
a time of huge change.
Gotcha.
Think of this deep dive as your shortcut to understanding a pivotal moment in history.
Right.
We're going to explore how the mighty British Empire tried to adapt to a world that was demanding something new: autonomy for its dominions. This led to some fascinating developments, including the Statute of Westminster and the formation of the Commonwealth.
Wow.
Buckle up, because we're about to unearth some historical details that might just surprise you.
I'm ready.
Now, we can't talk about this era without mentioning World War I.
Right.
The Dominions, places like Canada and South Africa, they really stepped up during the war effort.
Yep.
But this also fueled their desire for a greater say in their own affairs.
Makes sense.
It wasn't just about helping out anymore, it was about having a seat at the table.
Definitely a turning point.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that each dominion had its own unique set of priorities and concerns.
For sure.
For example, Canada, with its growing sense of national identity, was pushing for more control over its foreign policy.
Right.
South Africa, on the other hand, presented a particularly tricky situation for the British.
Oh, how so?
Well, the wounds of the Boer War were still fresh,
Yeah.
and there was a real fear that South Africa, with its strategic importance and resources, might just bolt from the empire altogether.
I see. So a lot at stake.
So the Brits are facing this rising tide of autonomy, especially in South Africa. What's their play here?
Good question.
Well, this is where the idea of the Commonwealth comes into the picture.
Okay.
This free association of equal nations sounds a bit radical for an empire, don't you think?
It does a little bit.
It was a brilliant, albeit calculated move.
How so?
On the surface, the Commonwealth offered a framework for cooperation and shared goals. Economic partnerships, political collaboration, all while maintaining those symbolic ties to the British monarch.
Interesting. So kind of a balancing act.
But underneath it was a clever way for Britain to adapt to the changing times while still clinging to some semblance of its global power.
I see.
A balancing act, if you will.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's unpack this balancing act.
Right.
We know the 1926 Imperial Conference was a key moment in this whole saga.
Right.
It was like a big family meeting, but with the fate of nations hanging in the balance.
Definitely high stakes.
Absolutely. Leaders from Britain and the Dominions gathered. And what emerged was the Balfour Declaration,
Okay.
a formal acknowledgement that the Dominions were no longer just colonies, but autonomous communities within the British Empire.
Wow. So a big step.
A huge step, but it was really just setting the stage for something even bigger.
Even bigger. What could that be?
That something bigger being the Statute of Westminster in 1931.
Okay.
This wasn't just some symbolic gesture. This was a legal game changer.
Right. So what did it actually do?
Right. Imagine living in Canada, South Africa, or the Irish Free State at this time.
Okay.
The Statute of Westminster granted them full legislative independence.
Wow.
They could make their own laws, chart their own course, without interference from British Parliament.
So a major shift in power.
Talk about a shift in power. I bet that created a buzz.
I bet.
This wasn't just about politics. It was about people's lives.
Right?
This was about the power to shape your own destiny.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But it's important to note that not all dominions were on the same timeline.
Oh, really?
While Canada, South Africa, and the Irish Free State jumped right in, Australia and New Zealand took a bit longer to ratify the statute, finally coming on board in the 1940s.
Interesting.
And then there's the curious case of Newfoundland.
What happened there?
They never actually ratified the statute and ended up becoming part of Canada in 1949 due to a unique set of economic and political circumstances.
Oh, wow.
History is full of these little twists and turns.
Really?
Okay, so we've got this seemingly progressive move by the British Empire.
Yeah.
But was it all just a PR stunt to make them look more civilized in a world that was increasingly skeptical of colonialism? Or was there more to it?
That's the question, isn't it?
That's the million-dollar question. And the answer, like most things in history, is a bit of both.
I figured.
On the one hand, Britain was definitely trying to adapt its image.
Right.
The old ways of blatant colonialism were becoming increasingly unpopular.
Yeah.
And they needed a new approach to maintain influence on the world stage.
Makes sense.
So a bit of rebranding for the empire.
Exactly. But there were also some very strategic advantages for Britain. Granting autonomy to the dominions meant fewer financial burdens for Britain, less risk of outright rebellion, and a continued flow of trade and resources within this new family of nations.
Oh, okay.
It was a way to cut costs, reduce headaches, and maintain a level of global clout all at the same time.
Wow.
Pretty savvy, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, very much so. But what about the people living through these changes? What were their reactions to this monumental shift in the British Empire?
Of course.
I imagine it must have been a mixed bag.
You're absolutely right. In Britain itself, there were those who saw it as a natural progression, a sign of a mature and evolving empire.
Mm-hmm.
They argued that clinging to the old ways would only lead to more conflict and ultimately weaken Britain's position in the world.
So a kind of pragmatic acceptance
Yeah.
that the world was changing and the empire needed to change with it.
Exactly, but of course not everyone was on board.
Right.
There are those, often deeply entrenched in the old imperial mindset, who saw it as a betrayal, a weakening of Britain's global standing.
Yeah.
They mourned the loss of direct control, the perceived erosion of British authority.
I can almost picture them shaking their fists and saying the empire is crumbling.
I know, right?
But what about in the dominions themselves?
Right.
How did people there view these changes?
Well, as you can imagine, there was a wave of excitement and optimism,
Yeah.
particularly among those who'd been advocating for greater self-determination. It was a victory, a chance to shape their own destinies, their own laws, and their own futures, free from the dictates of a distant power.
So a sense of liberation, of finally being in the driver's seat?
Precisely.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that not everyone in the dominions was cheering.
Right, of course.
There were those who had benefited from the imperial system, who saw it as a source of stability and prosperity.
Uh-huh.
For them, this move towards independence was met with anxiety and uncertainty.
It's like any major societal shift, right?
Yeah.
There are always those who embrace change and those who resist it.
Exactly.
Kind of reminds me of how we react to big changes in our own lives, that mix of excitement, apprehension, maybe even a little fear of the unknown.
It's a universal experience, isn't it?
Yeah.
Change, even when it's ultimately for the better, can be unsettling.
Yeah, totally unsettling. Okay, so we've explored the reactions to the Statute of Westminster and the creation of the Commonwealth, a mix of hope and trepidation.
Uh-huh.
But let's zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Where does all of this fit into the grand narrative of empires?
Ah, yes, the big picture.
Haha.
Well, the British Empire, like all empires before it, was facing a fundamental challenge in the early 20th century.
Okay.
The world was changing rapidly, driven by forces like nationalism, industrialization, and the rise of new ideologies.
Right.
The old model of colonial domination was becoming increasingly untenable. It was too expensive, too unwieldy, and frankly, too ethically problematic to maintain in its traditional form.
So the British Empire was caught in a bind.
Yeah.
They needed to adapt to survive, but they were also reluctant to let go of their power and influence. What a dilemma.
Precisely. And the Statute of Westminster, along with the creation of the Commonwealth, was their attempt to square that circle.
Interesting.
It was a way to evolve with the times while still holding on to some semblance of global dominance, a very delicate balancing act.
A delicate balancing act. And is this something unique to the British Empire?
Mm.
Or have other empires throughout history faced similar challenges?
Oh, absolutely. It's a recurring theme. Throughout history, empires rise. They reach their peak. They face internal and external pressures, and they are forced to adapt or decline.
Wow.
Think about the Roman Empire granting citizenship to conquered peoples, or the Ottoman Empire trying to modernize its military.
Right.
These were all attempts to hold on to power in the face of changing circumstances.
So it's like a historical pattern repeating itself.
Yeah,
Empires rise, they reach their limits, and then they have to find creative, sometimes desperate ways to adapt.
it highlights the importance of understanding historical cycles, of recognizing how past events can inform our understanding of the present,
Okay.
and perhaps even offer glimpses into the future.
No, that's a thought-provoking idea. Are you suggesting that we might be witnessing a similar transformation happening right now, not necessarily with empires in the traditional sense, but with global power dynamics as a whole?
It's certainly worth considering. We live in a world where the lines between nations are becoming increasingly blurred.
I see.
Think about the rise of multinational corporations,
Yeah.
the influence of non-state actors, the interconnectedness of the global economy.
Yeah.
These forces are challenging traditional notions of power, creating new centers of influence.
It's almost like that world map we talked about at the beginning, the one with constantly shifting colors and borders.
Exactly.
But instead of empires, it's these new networks of power and influence that are shaping the global landscape.
Exactly. And just like the British Empire had to adapt to survive, so too Will nation-states need to find new ways to navigate this evolving world order? It's a fascinating time to be alive, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It feels like we're standing on the precipice of something big, a historical turning point where the old rules no longer apply.
Yeah.
It's both exciting and a bit daunting, and it definitely makes you wonder, what does the future hold for global power dynamics?
Right.
How will nations adapt to these new realities?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And while we can't predict the future with certainty, we can look to the past for clues. The story of the British Empire's transformation offers valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities that arise when the balance of power shifts.
Yeah.
It reminds us that adaptation is key to survival, both for empires and for nations in the modern world.
Yeah, it really is like we've been time traveling, tracing the footsteps of the British Empire as it navigated a changing world. And now we're looking ahead, wondering what lessons we can glean from the past to understand the present.
Right.
And perhaps even anticipate the future.
History rarely offers simple answers,
Right.
but it does provide us with a framework for understanding how power dynamics evolve.
Okay.
And who knows, maybe by studying these historical shifts, we can better equip ourselves to navigate the complexities of the world today.
I love that idea. It's like we're not just passively observing history.
Yeah.
We're actively engaging with it, using it as a tool to make sense of our own times. But before we get too carried away with the future,
Right.
let's take a moment to appreciate what we've uncovered in this deep dive.
Okay.
We started by exploring the British Empire's ambitious attempt to adapt to a world demanding change.
Right.
We looked at the Statute of Westminster, a landmark legal document that granted legislative independence to several dominions.
Right.
And we delved into the creation of the Commonwealth, a unique experiment in maintaining global influence
Yeah.
through cooperation rather than outright control. We even unearthed some surprising twists and turns along the way.
Oh, like what?
Like the story of Newfoundland and its unique path to joining Canada.
Right.
It's amazing how these seemingly small details can reveal so much about the larger forces at play.
Absolutely. And what's even more fascinating is that the story of the British Empire's transformation didn't end with the Statute of Westminster.
Oh, really?
The Commonwealth continues to exist today, albeit in a very different form.
Wow.
It's evolved over time, reflecting the changing dynamics of the world.
So it's not just a relic of the past.
Right.
It's a living, breathing entity that continues to grapple with questions of power, identity, and cooperation on a global scale. Exactly.
That in itself is worth pondering. But for now, dear listener, we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Okay.
We've explored the past, pondered the present, and even dared to glimpse into the future, and hopefully we've left you with more than just facts and figures.
Right.
I hope we sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and given you a fresh perspective on how power dynamics shape the world around us.
Well said.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought to ponder as we navigate this ever-changing world
Okay.
with its new power structures and shifting alliances. What lessons can we learn from the British Empire's attempt to balance control and adaptation? What does it mean to be powerful in the 21st century, and how can we use that power responsibly and effectively?
Those are the questions.
These are questions that will continue to challenge us, provoke us, and hopefully inspire us to create a more just and equitable world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brain cells firing. The world is full of fascinating stories just waiting to be discovered.